Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be experimenting with getting a faux nickel-plated finish during the build of this resin-printed Graflex lightsaber. Alright, I started this project with a free file that I found on Thingiverse. I will link it as well as all the materials I used down in the description below. I say started because I ended up switching to a paid STL file later down the road, but we'll talk about that later. This project began like any other resin printing project, lots of sanding and support removal. I think I'm finally getting the hang of my exposure settings on my resin printer, and so post-processing was a bit easier this time. I recently rewatched The Empire Strikes Back, which was the inspiration for this build. I figured it would be great practice to try and replicate the shiny nickel-plated finish on the Graflex. I initially wanted to build the Empire Strikes Back variant of the Graflex. Believe it or not, there are actually multiple differences between the Graflex models throughout the movies. I used the complete lightsaber prop guide by Seth S. from the RPF to figure out what those differences were. I'll link that in the description as well. Unfortunately, I realized a bit last minute that the STL files I had downloaded were sort of an amalgamation of various Graflex parts from across all the movies, and it was not accurate to any specific version. This was one of the reasons I eventually restarted the project with a paid STL file, but like I said, I'll touch on that a bit later. To imitate the brushed metal effect that the Graflex hilt has, I first started out with my tried and true method that I had first attempted on my Cal Kestis lightsaber build. The idea is that once you've sanded all your parts smooth and removed any unnatural layer lines, you go back over all your pieces with a rough grit sandpaper to scratch directional lines across the surface of each part that you want looking like it's brushed or polished. You do this before primer and paint so that your scratches take on the same metal color as the rest of your part. Once I'm done giving all my pieces this brushed look, I go back over all the high points and edges to add scrapes and scuffs for a bit of pre-weathering so that these scratches also take on the metal color I'll be applying later. Before painting all my parts with a metal color, I went over everything with a coat of semi-gloss black. This coat of black helps add a bit more reflectivity to your metal color and just further helps sell the look of real metal. Here you can see what that brushed texture looks like once the parts have been painted black. Once the black paint had completely dried, I mounted the hilt pieces into my drill and began to apply coat after coat of lightly dry brushed silver paint, being sure to keep my brush strokes running in the same direction that my sanding marks were. I used Vallejo's white aluminum metal color for this. Despite the fact that this is one of the brightest metal colors they offer, the shine that I was looking for just wasn't quite there. And even though this technique worked almost flawlessly for my Cal Kestis lightsaber build, I just was not loving the look that I was getting. But I decided to soldier on, hoping that maybe later on down the line I could fix it. I dry brushed the rest of the pieces with the same metal color and moved on to the smaller details. I used Rub 'n Buff's Antique Gold for all the brass accents on the hilt. I really like this color because I feel like it mimics the look of real brass very well. I mixed up a tan for the base and a red for the buttons, and then moved on to my first experiment with trying to get a shiny metal-plated finish on my parts. I'll touch on this technique a bit more in a minute, but I first saw this idea used on a channel called Player 2 Props when he built a replica of Obi-Wan's lightsaber from the Kenobi show. As you can see, I'm getting a pretty shiny metal finish here, and I had initially planned to use this metallic powder on the entire hilt, but I got scared and figured it was best to test on small pieces beforehand. The overall effect is pretty nice, but the metal flakes were a bit chunky and ended up giving these pieces kind of a glittery look rather than a uniform silver surface. And so during these next few build steps, I was looking online to see if I could find a finer metallic powder to use on the second iteration of this hilt. The Episode 5 variant of the Graflex has this half-inch shiny metal tape wrapped around the clamp section of the hilt, most likely to obscure the Graflex logo that is clearly visible on the Episode 4 variant. I just used some aluminum HVAC tape for this. Here you can really see the drastic difference in shininess level between the tape and the painted piece, and it was at this step that I really decided I needed to build a second, more convincing version. I decided to finish the construction of this version though, just so I could get the hang of building the complete hilt first. Alright, so I did a complete redo. And I figured as long as I was doing a full redo, I might as well print a more accurate version of the hilt. I found this version on Etsy, and I'll link it in the description below. Here you can see that this version was missing the sort of bubbly extrusion that comes out below both buttons on the Graflex sleeve. Also, this version has what I believe is the episode 2 variant of the bunny ears. Kind of a strange little detail, and I don't know why they would have chosen to alter the Graflex so significantly in both episode 2 and 3. Another detail that both these models didn't get quite right was that this little plate here is meant to have a tiny indent right above the button, and so I just edited the file in Blender to be a bit more accurate. Another difference between the two models is you can see that the first version I used is lacking these square indents around the clamp section. Okay, as I waited for this fine metallic powder to arrive in the mail, I went back through the entire process I've already shown you, so I'll spare you those details. And again, I'll say, this idea is not originally mine. I first saw Player 2 Props use this, and he actually credits a channel by the name of Pete Rondo with giving him the idea. I'll link both those videos in the description. In Pete's video, he uses a special UV resin as a base before applying the metal powder. But in Player 2's video, he said he just used a coat of tacky black paint. I decided to try his technique since it meant I had one less thing to buy. Essentially, all I'm doing is spraying my paint, waiting for it to dry just a hair, and while it's still tacky, applying the metallic powder very liberally across the surface, and then slowly buffing it out. I found it was best to not try and conserve powder, and instead laid it on pretty thick, which helped with coverage. Before applying this powder to the hilt, I ran a few tests, and found that a white undercoat gave a slightly higher sheen than a black undercoat, and so I decided to do the body of the hilt with white and the small details with black, just to add a little bit of variation in the metal colors. I sort of shot myself in the foot here since I didn't wait for my white paint to completely dry to the right consistency before applying the metallic paint, and it sort of ended up globbing up the paint in a few sections. But thankfully I had started with the bottom section of the hilt, and the T-tracks eventually covered most of the damage. Now, aside from this little bit of self-inflicted damage, this powder was looking really nice, but the problem came when it was time to seal it. I ran a few tests, and even when using the glossiest of my clear coats, the surface of the metal immediately dulled significantly. And without any clear coat, the surface of this metal was super finicky and very prone to fingerprints and smudges, and even after the paint had completely dried, I was very worried about even touching this thing. In the end, I decided not to clear coat it for the sake of the shine, but like I said, the metal powder was extremely delicate, and even though I was being as careful as possible during assembly, it still picked up a bunch of nicks and dings and smudges and scratches. And so unless I can find a clear coat that doesn't affect the shine of the metal powder, I don't know that this technique is a viable option for replicating the nickel plating on a Graflex. But I'll let you guys be the judge in these upcoming glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. Although my inclination is to write this project off as a bit of a failure, I know that that's not entirely true since I still learned a lot, and the hilt does look pretty good sitting on my shelf at a distance. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. And I'd like to say a massive thank you to the almost 2,000 people who have subscribed to the channel to this point. I'm excited to see where this channel goes, and I'm looking forward to all the projects I have planned. Thank you again for watching. Have a great day.